In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at South Carolina Curriculum Standard 5-5.1, which is going to focus more on the events of the Cold War. In the last lesson, we learned more about what life was like in America following World War II. In this lesson, we're going to be focusing more on those Cold War events and things including McCarthyism in the United States, the spread of communism, the Korean conflict, Sputnik, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War. So on the next clean page in your notebook, if you'll set up this indicator, I'm going to go ahead and advance in the lesson. So what happens following World War II is there is a rivalry that develops between the Soviet Union and the United States. Both countries had very different goals, and so let's think about the Soviet Union first. The Soviet Union's goal was to spread communism, which was their political and economic system in which the government owns and controls businesses and property. Now, the United States had the opposite goal. They wanted to contain the spread of communism. This becomes known as something like as a containment policy. So they wanted to contain communism. They did not want those ideals to spread in the world, and particularly the United States and other Western European nations. Those places actually encouraged democratic governments and wanted to give the ability for people to express their personal freedoms and have free enterprise for an economic system. So when you look at this, things that I would put down in my notes, you need to know that it was a rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then you need to, and you can do this in your own words, you need to be able to kind of summarize what was the goal of the Soviet Union and then the goal of the United States. So both had very different ideals, and these things come up over and over again over time, because the Cold War runs from 1945 all the way till 1991 in world history. So let's look at some of the things that happened. Well, one of them was something called McCarthyism. And McCarthyism in the United States was related to this idea of communism, in that people who supported the ideas of communism were increasingly feared by many Americans. This fear was fueled by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, who announced that hundreds of communists were working in the United States government with the intent of overturning the government. This Red Scare came to be called McCarthyism. The McCarthy era is known for the fear and sensationalism promoted by Senator McCarthy and the mass media. However, no secret agents were ever uncovered by McCarthy's accusations and investigations. So McCarthy had this list of people, and this list contained different people who were connected to the government who McCarthy said were communist. And on said list, these people were various connection to the government and different types of roles in the government. So what happens is McCarthy gets put out there that he has this information, and it fuels a scare of communism to the point that they have to investigate. And it ends up being that really there was no secret agents that were ever uncovered because of all this. For each of these slides on the topics, what I want you to do is kind of write down the topic in your notes, and then in your own words, put down why it was important and pull information. I want you to think about how you can read and what you need to write down throughout the notes today. So then something else that happens in the 1950s, we end up involved in something called the Korean conflict. And the Korean conflict started when North Korea's communist government invaded South Korea with the intention of reuniting the peninsula under one communist government. South Korea did not want to become a communist nation. As a result, the United States, with the support of the United Nations, responded by sending American soldiers to defend South Korea and contain the spread of communism. Once again, that whole idea of containment, that containment policy that we saw earlier. The war ended in a stalemate and the peninsula remained divided. South Korea remained a democratic nation. North Korea remained a communist nation allied with the Soviet Union. So remember what the word allied means. You know, we talked about allies in World War II. So think about what that means. So once again, for this one, I want you to kind of think about what's the topic and then why was it important? If you think about it for just a second, because of the involvement, there ends up being the ability to stop South Korea from becoming communist. So that idea, that containment policy worked here in this case. The other thing that the United States found itself involved in was a competition between the Soviet Union and itself in what becomes known as the space race. The space race was started when the Soviet Union successfully launched an unmanned satellite, Sputnik. This event highlighted the need for an excellent education system and was a unifying force for American industry. It also promoted the development of computer technologies that would affect other segments of American life. So, because of this competition, it was a huge deal in 1957 when Sputnik is in space. There was all of a sudden this competition that gets fueled. This is part of why, for example, the Eisenhower administration creates NASA. And then it is President Kennedy who establishes the goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Although the Soviet Union was first to put a man in outer space, the United States was first to put a man, Neil Armstrong, on the moon. So the thing that this impacts in our country is really the spread of technology and the importance on education. There was a lot of emphasis in our country placed on math and science education during this time period because of the space race and the competition between us and the Soviets. Now, another major event that happens is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this rivalry comes very close to being a nuclear war. Because what happens is the Soviet Union begins shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, which is a communist country which was 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So if you think about it, generally we are 90 miles away from Columbia, South Carolina here. So from between here and Columbia, that's how far Cuba was from the tip of Florida. From this location, the Soviet Union could launch nuclear weapons toward targets in the United States. So it would put nuclear weapons within the range of the United States. You know, think about how short of a distance it would be between Columbia and Clover, and what it would be like to have nuclear weapons in that close of a range. Well, what happens is over several days it appeared that the two nations would soon be at war. But at the last moment, the ships carrying the nuclear missiles turned back. Most historians agree that this was the closest the United States and the Soviet Union ever came to war. As a result, efforts were made to avoid such crises in the future, including the installation of the hotline and the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So there's things that actually happened because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And many do agree that this was the closest that we ever came to some type of nuclear attack. Another thing that happened during the time period of the Cold War was the Vietnam War. So we had the Korean conflict, the Soviets send Sputnik into space, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then Vietnam breaks out. And Vietnam is very much like the Korean conflict because it was the whole idea of the ability of the United States to try to stop the spread of communism. As in Korea, the Soviet Union supported the communist government of North and the United States supported the democratic government of the South. However, unlike the war in Korea, The war in Vietnam started because the government of South Vietnam refused to comply with a peace agreement that had been signed calling for elections to reunite the country. So the government of South Vietnam feared that they would lose the election because the leader of the North Vietnam was very popular among the people. So the fighting continued for many years and ended in the United States withdrawal rather than a stalemate. The United States faced a difficult challenge fighting in a jungle-like environment. Public sentiment began to grow against Americans fighting in Vietnam because the war was widely covered on television. There was so much media that actually during the war, many Americans turned against it and were very openly displaying their distaste for the United States being involved. South Vietnam continued to fight the communists, but soon surrendered and united with North Vietnam as a communist nation. So in the end, the whole region becomes communist. Then another aspect of the Cold War is the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviets to separate the communist and democratic portions of Berlin, which had been divided between the Allies at the end of World War II. People who lived in the East were forbidden to cross to the other side and vice versa. It became a difference between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies. The wall was finally torn down in 1989, signifying the collapse of communist control of Eastern Europe and an end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States is in sight. And you see some pictures down here of the wall being built and then later with the wall being destroyed. So with so many topics going on during the Cold War, what I want you to do today is create a concept map that connects all of the causes and events over the course of the Cold War. So I've set up a bubble for you so that you can start your concept map off with Cold War in the middle. And then coming off of it, you want to put off the events and things related to Cold War. So for example, you could draw a bubble out for the Berlin Wall. And that bubble would have things coming off of it related to the Berlin Wall. You can go back in the video and pull information as you need to develop your concept map. And I will be checking these concept maps in class. Finish. Finish.